It wasn't just a restaurant. It was my grandmother's legacy written in flour, rosemary, and slow-cooked love. I could feel her standing behind me as I stood before the investors, my voice steady, my hands gesturing towards the presentation board. The air in the boardroom was crisp, smelling of expensive leather and ambition. My ambition. The concept for the hearth is built on one simple principle. I said, my heart thrumming with a pride I had earned: authenticity. We will use locally sourced ingredients, time-honored techniques and recipes passed down through 3 generations. I clicked to the next slide. A picture of my grandmother, her hands dusted with flour, filled the screen. This is more than a business plan. It's a story that I believe will resonate deeply with people tired of manufactured experiences. My brother Julian sat beside me, nodding in perfect agreement. He was the handsome face, the charming salesman, my older brother, the golden child. He'd insisted on being here to support me. His smile was as bright and polished as his shoes. I moved through the financial projections, the marketing strategy, the design, aesthetics I had spent countless nights perfecting. Every number, every word was mine. The investors, 2 men in sharp suits named Mr. Prosecicate, Harrison and Mr. Cole, seemed impressed. They were leaning forward, asking smart questions. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of real hope. This was it. This was the moment my life would change. And finally, I said, my voice filled with emotion, the heart of it all, the signature dish, my grandmother's 7-hour braised lamb. If I may jump in, Julian's voice cut through the air, smooth as silk. I stopped surprised. He stood up, placing a hand gently on my shoulder, a gesture that looked supportive to them, but to me felt like a cage. What my sister has so passionately described as the soul of our venture, he said, his voice resonating with a confidence I never possessed. He walked around the table, commanding the room in a way I never could. But what will make the hearth a multi-million-dollar success isn't just the soul, it's the strategy, the vision for expansion. He hadn't just jumped in, he had taken over. He started talking about franchising, about merchandising, about turning our grandmother's recipes into a mass market product line, things we had never discussed, things I would never agree to. He was using my words, my passion, but twisting them into something cold and commercial. My presentation, my story was dissolving before my eyes. Mr. Harrison looked at Julie and then glanced at me. A flicker of pity, maybe, or just dismissal. Julian saw his opening. He smiled a warm, predatory smile. Look, my sister is a fantastic cook. A true artist in the kitchen, he said, the words dripping with condescension. He gestured towards me as if I were a quaint decoration. But to run a project of this scale, gentlemen, you need a businessman. Silence. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just an interruption anymore. It was an execution. My hands started shaking. I tucked them under the table, hoping no one would notice. I felt the blood drain from my face. The voices in the room, Mr. Harrison and Mr. Cole now, talking excitedly with Julian, turned into a dull buzz. It was like I was underwater, watching the world move on without me. They were shaking hands. Julian was laughing, clapping Mr. Harrison on the back. My dream was being signed away, and I was just a ghost in the room. He didn't even look at me, not once. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember the traffic lights or the turns. I just remember the feeling of my own hands gripping the steering wheel, the leather cool against my skin, my knuckles white. That night, my parents called for a celebratory dinner. Of course they did. I sat at the familiar oak table of my childhood, a ghost in my own home. The scent of my mother's roast chicken, a smell that usually meant comfort, felt like an accusation. Julian was holding court, his voice booming as he recounted his victory in the boardroom. He painted a picture of a deal on the verge of collapse, saved at the last second by his bold, decisive vision. My vision. My father, a man who measured success in stock prices and firm handshakes, beamed at him. "That's my boy," he said, raising his glass of wine. "Knew you had it in you." My mother turned to me, her smile tight with a practiced sort of sympathy. "Ellie, honey, aren't you proud of your brother? He's taken your lovely little idea and really elevated it." I stared down at my plate, pushing a single green bean around with my fork. My throat was too tight to speak. "Be the bigger person, sweetie," she continued, her voice soft and insistent. "This is a win for the whole family." Be the bigger person, the family motto. It was usually code for let Julian have his way. I had been the bigger person my entire life. I had been the bigger person when he broke my favorite doll and claimed I had done it. I'd been the bigger person when he copied my college entrance essay and got into the better school. It seemed my fate was to be a stepping stone wide and sturdy enough for my brother to climb on. I looked up, meeting my mother's eyes. He stole it. The words were quiet, a tiny, sharp stone thrown against a brick wall. The table went silent. Julian scoffed, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. Oh, here we go. Don't be so dramatic, Ellie. It's business. You wouldn't understand. Julian always knew how to make things bigger, honey, my mother added, her hand covering his in a show of solidarity. It's for the best. I stood up my chair, scraping against the hardwood floor. I think I'm feeling sick, I mumbled and fled the room before they could see the cracks forming in my composure. Later that week, Julian called. His voice was magnanimous, dripping with false generosity. He told me the restaurant was moving forward faster than he'd expected. He told me he was building a team. And look, Ellie, he said, his tone softening into something meant to sound kind. I know you're upset, but I don't want to cut you out completely. How about you come work in the kitchen? We need a good dishwasher, someone reliable. It would be a way for you to, still be a part of it. A dishwasher. In my own restaurant, he was offering me a front row seat to watch him live out my dream, and he was framing it as an act of charity. The humiliation was a physical thing, a bitter taste at the back of my throat. But as he spoke, another thought, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of my anger. If I was on the outside, I would see nothing. But if I was on the inside, okay, I said the word feeling foreign on my tongue. I'll do it. I started the following Monday. The work was grueling, my hands constantly raw from the hot water and harsh chemicals. I kept my head down, I watched, I listened, and I tried to forget about the money. The $25,000 our grandmother had left for us. A joint account her will had said for us to build something beautiful together. A month later, a letter arrived, a final notice for the insurance on my car. I frowned. I had set up an automatic payment from the joint account specifically for that bill. I told myself it was a bank error, but a knot of ice was forming in my stomach. That night I sat in my small apartment, the glow of the laptop screen lighting my face. My hands were trembling slightly as I typed in the username and password for the inheritance fund. I clicked enter. The page loaded. My eyes scanned for the balance. There it was, in cold, hard numbers. $312. My breath caught in my chest. I clicked on the transaction history, my heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against my ribs. There were the small automatic payments for my car insurance. And then there was another entry dated 3 days before the investor meeting. A single, massive withdrawal, $24,600, transferred to a personal account, Julian's account. The shock was gone. It had been burned out of me in that boardroom at that dinner table. It was replaced by something else, something cold and heavy and very, very quiet. The anger didn't fade. It froze. It settled deep in my bones and became a quiet, cold engine that got me out of bed every morning. My days fell into a grueling rhythm. The roar of the industrial dishwasher, the steam that fogged my glasses, the slick feel of grease on my skin. I was a ghost in my own machine, invisible to the line, cooks, the servers, and most of all, to my brother. And from the shadows of the dish pit, I watched. Julian ran the restaurant like a stage play, and he was the star. He cared only about what the customers could see. The dining room was immaculate, the lighting was perfect, the servers' uniforms were crisp. But the kitchen was where the truth lived. I saw the deliveries of lower-grade produce. Tomatoes that were a shade too pale, herbs that lacked the vibrant scent they should have had. I overheard the prep cooks complaining that they had to stretch the chicken stock, watering it down until it was a pale imitation of my grandmother's rich, savory base. The real show came one Tuesday afternoon. I was wrestling with a stack of greasy pans when Julian stormed into the kitchen. He was holding a small, clear box of saffron. He marched right up to the head chef, a seasoned professional named Marco, who had worked in Michelin star restaurants. "What is this?" Julian demanded, shaking the box. "Do you know how much this cost?" "This is Spanish saffron." Marco didn't flinch. "It's the best," he said, his voice calm. "It's what the paella recipe requires." "The recipe requires saffron," Julian snapped back. It doesn't say I have to refinance the building to get it. I saw a supplier who has Iranian saffron for half the price. Marco sighed, the weary sigh of a man who had fought this battle before. Julian, it's not the same. The flavor profile is different, it's harsher. It will change the dish. It will save me $20 a plate, Julian retorted, his face turning red. That's the profile I care about. You're a cook, Marco. You are not an accountant. Stop wasting my money. He threw the box of Spanish saffron onto the stainless steel counter and stormed out. Marco stood there for a long moment, staring at the precious red threads. Then he looked over, and for the first time, he met my eyes. He saw me. He saw that I understood. He shook his head slowly and went back to his station. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Julian, so arrogant in his ignorance, played over and over in my mind. He was going to run our grandmother's legacy into the ground, one cheap ingredient at a time. The thought sparked a memory. I got out of bed and went to the closet, pulling down a heavy cardboard box filled with things I had inherited from my grandmother's house. Tucked at the bottom, wrapped in linen, was her recipe book. It was a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages soft and stained with history. Her handwriting, a graceful, looping cursive, filled every page. I ran my fingers over the notes she had made in the margins, the little adjustments and discoveries. This book was my most sacred possession. I flipped to the section on main courses, my fingers tracing the familiar titles, until I found it Nana's 7-hour braised lamb. It was the restaurant's signature dish. My signature dish. I read through the ingredients, the steps I knew by heart, and then I saw it. Tucked at the very bottom of the page, written in a slightly faded blue ink, was a note I had forgotten about. It was a warning. It read, "Note to self-tested Moroccan thyme today as a substitute for fresh Provençal. Flavor is close, but do not use for the lamb. It releases a bitter phenolic compound if held at cooking temperature for more than 2 hours. Ruins the entire batch. Stick to the good stuff." I stared at the words. My grandmother's handwriting seemed to jump off the page. It felt like a message sent across time just for me. A bitter phenolic compound. Ruins the entire batch. He would never know the difference. Julian, with his cheap saffron and his watered-down stock, would see time on an invoice and nothing more. He wouldn't know the difference between Moroccan and Provençal. He wouldn't understand the chemistry. He would only see the price tag. It wasn't just a warning. It was a roadmap. My grandmother hadn't just given me a recipe. She had given me a weapon. A weapon is useless without a strategy. For the next 2 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was Eliza the dishwasher, my hands submerged in suds, my face a mask of weary indifference. But by night, my small apartment became a war room. The glow of my laptop replaced the moon, and the quiet hum of my old refrigerator was the only sound as I dove headfirst into research. I wasn't just a cook anymore. I was a chemist, a logistician, a psychologist studying a single subject, my brother Julian. I started with the thyme. I needed to find a supplier, a real one, that exclusively sold the cheaper Moroccan variety. It had to be plausible. It took 3 nights of scrolling through obscure wholesale food distributor websites, but I finally found it. A new company out of New Jersey, Global Spice Imports, with a slick website and prices that were almost too good to be true. Perfect. Next came the science. It wasn't enough to know the reaction happened. I needed to know exactly when and why. I spent hours in the public library poring over botanical journals and chemistry textbooks I hadn't looked at since college. I learned more than I ever wanted to know about phenolic compounds and thermal decomposition. I calculated the exact temperature and time required. The conditions wouldn't just be met on a busy night, they would be guaranteed. But theory wasn't enough. I needed proof. One night after my shift, I told Marco I'd forgotten my keys and needed to run back inside. The kitchen was empty and quiet, smelling of bleach and old grease. The silence was a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled a small package from my bag. It was a 1-ounce bag of Moroccan thyme I had bought with my own cash from a tiny spice shop downtown. I went to the walk-in cooler and took a small container of leftover lamb stock. My hands were shaking, but my movements were precise. On a back burner, I set a small saucepan with the stock and the cheap thyme to simmer. I looked at the clock on the wall, 10:15 p.m. According to my calculations, the change would begin in just over 2 hours. I spent the time cleaning, not because I had to, but because I couldn't stand still. I scrubbed counters that were already clean. I polished steel that already gleamed. I waited. At 12:30 a.m., I turned off the burner. The stock looked the same. It smelled almost the same. I let it cool for a few minutes, the knot in my stomach tightening. What if I was wrong? I dipped a clean spoon into the pot and raised it to my lips. The initial flavor was fine, the familiar savory taste of lamb and herbs. But then it hit. A secondary taste, an acrid chemical bitterness that coated the back of my tongue. It wasn't just a bad taste. It was the taste of decay, of something that had fundamentally broken. It was the taste of failure. It worked. It was disgusting. I poured the entire batch down the drain and washed the pot twice, leaving no trace. As I walked home through the empty city streets, the plan, which had been a series of disconnected thoughts, finally crystallized into a single beautiful, terrifying structure in my mind. And just like that, I saw it. The entire plan laid out in my mind. He wouldn't be ruined by my anger. He'd be ruined by his own ignorance. He'd be ruined by the very thing he prided himself on, his supposed business acumen. Step 1, find the supplier. Done. Step 2, craft the proposal. I would write him an email not as his sister, but as a low-level employee who had stumbled upon a cost-saving opportunity. I would use his own business school jargon words like optimization and efficiency to appeal to his ego. Step 3, create the evidence. The email would be my insurance. A clear, documented recommendation that I would subtly advise him to run by the chef, knowing his pride would never allow him to do so. His approval would be the signature on his own death warrant. Step 4, let his ego do the rest. He had built his restaurant on my foundation. I was about to show him that the architect could also be the demolitionist. The architect's blueprint was complete. Now it was time to lay the first stone. I sat at the rickety desk in my apartment, the glow of the screen illuminating a single blank email draft. Every word had to be perfect. Not just plausible, but irresistible to a man like Julian. I took a deep breath and began to type. The subject line was deliberately boring Q3 supplier cost optimization proposal. The email itself was a masterpiece of corporate praise and subtle manipulation. I wrote it not as his sister, but as a diligent, low-level employee eager to impress. To Julian Vance. From Eliza Vance, subject Q3 supplier cost optimization proposal. Dear Julian, following my analysis of our Q3 kitchen expenditures and in line with your excellent strategic focus on fiscal responsibility, I've identified a significant cost-saving opportunity. A new supplier, Global Spice Imports, offers Moroccan thyme at a 32% lower cost per unit than our current Provençal thyme from our primary vendor. I paused, rereading the sentence. 32%. The number was just large enough to be exciting, just specific enough to sound well-researched. I continued. I have cross-referenced the botanical specifications, and the product is a near identical match. Adopting this new supplier could result in substantial quarterly savings and improve our overall profit margins significantly, a key metric I know you are focused on. Then came the most important part, the sentence that was both my shield and my sword. While the flavor profile is a 98% match in initial tests, I would recommend having Chef Marco run a large-scale batch test before committing just to ensure it meets your high standards. I smiled. It was perfect. I was giving him an out a chance to do his due diligence in a way that I knew his monumental ego would never allow him to take. Asking Marco for a test would be an admission that he, Julian Vance, needed a mere chef's approval. It would never happen. I read the entire email one last time. It was clean, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was a Trojan horse, and I was about to wheel it right up to the front gate. My finger hovered over the mouse. My heart was pounding, a frantic bird trapped in my chest. This was the point of no return. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. The trap was set. All it needed was for the mouse to take the cheese. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. Every minute at the restaurant was a quiet form of torture. I watched Julian from across the kitchen. He was on his phone, constantly barking orders, charming a food blogger he'd invited for a tour, tasting a sauce, and declaring it acceptable with a dismissive wave. He never looked my way. He never mentioned the email. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to creep in. Had I been too clever? Was the trap too obvious? Maybe he just deleted it, another piece of spam from a nobody employee. Maybe he'd actually listened and forwarded it to Marco, who would have spotted the danger in a second. I was cleaning out the grease trap, my hands elbow deep in lukewarm, disgusting water, when I felt my phone buzz in my back pocket. My stomach clenched. I pulled my hands out, wiped them furiously on my dirty apron, and fumbled for the phone. My fingers were slick with grease, and it almost slipped from my grasp. I squinted at the screen. One new email. The preview was stark. From Julian Vance Q3 supplier, cost optimization proposal. My breath hitched. My thumb trembled as I tapped the screen to open it. I was expecting a negotiation, a question, a dismissal. Instead, the body of the email contained just 3 words. 3 words and a list of other recipients. He hadn't just replied to me, he had replied to all, and he had added the entire accounting department. The email read, "Excellent. Implement immediately. Julian Vance, CEO, The Hearth." I stared at the screen at the cold black text. He hadn't just taken the bait, he had swallowed it whole, and he had created a permanent time-stamped record of his own catastrophic decision for the entire company to see. I turned off the phone and slid it back into my pocket. I looked at my reflection in the greasy stainless steel of the dish pit. My face was smudged with dirt, my hair was a mess, and I was covered in the filth of a restaurant kitchen. But for the first time in months, I smiled. A real smile, cold and sharp and full of terrible promise. The mouse had taken the cheese, and the trap was about to snap shut. The night of the grand opening arrived like a movie premiere. A red carpet was rolled out on the sidewalk. Valets in crisp black uniforms whisked away luxury cars. Through the large picture windows, I could see the dining room glittering. It was a sea of black dresses, tailored suits, and the flashing lights of cameras. Food bloggers, local celebrities, and most importantly, our investors were all there. At the center of it all was Julian. He moved through the crowd with the easy grace of a shark shaking hands, kissing cheeks, his laughter echoing above the sophisticated murmur of the room. He was a king in the castle I had designed for him. His castle built with my ideas and my grandmother's stolen money. In the kitchen, it was a different world. It was 100 degrees, filled with the hiss of searing steaks, the clang of pans, and the staccato rhythm of Chef Marco calling out orders. It was controlled chaos. I was in my corner, a soldier in the war, feeding stacks of plates into the hungry mouth of the dishwasher. My hands worked on autopilot, but my eyes and ears were on high alert. The new, cheaper Moroccan thyme had arrived 2 days earlier in large, unlabeled sacks. Julian had made the switch himself, informing Marco that it was a more potent varietal of their usual supply. Marco had been skeptical, but he was an employee, not a partner. He had no choice but to use it. Around 6:30 p.m., as the first guests were arriving, Marco was tasting the massive vats of the 7-hour lamb sauce. He dipped a spoon in, sipped, and frowned. A sous chef next to him asked, "Everything okay, chef?" Marco was quiet for a moment. "It's fine," he said, though his tone was uncertain. "There's a note I can't quite place, a bit more earthy than usual. Make sure you keep the heat steady, don't let it scorch." He didn't know it, but he was following my script perfectly. He was keeping the sauce at the exact temperature needed for the thermal decomposition to begin. I glanced at the clock. The countdown had started. 7:30 p.m. The first orders for the signature dish went out. A beautiful plate of tender lamb nestled on a bed of creamy polenta drizzled with the rich, dark sauce. From the dish pit, I could just see the servers placing them in front of the guests. My narration would become a scientist observing an experiment. Another 30 minutes at that temperature, I thought to myself, and the phenolic compound would begin to break down completely. The next half hour was a blur of activity. The kitchen was a whirlwind of motion and steam. Orders flew in, plates flew out. Julian briefly stuck his head into the kitchen, his face flushed with triumph. "It's a hit," he yelled to Marco over the noise. "They love it." But then at 8:05 p.m., the first plate came back. A server, a young woman named Chloe, with a perpetually worried expression, brought it to the pass. "Table 7, she whispered to Marco. "They said the lamb tastes bitter." Marco looked offended. "Bitter? That's impossible. He took a clean fork, tasted a piece of the lamb from the returned plate. His confident expression faltered. A look of complete confusion washed over his face. He walked back to the main vat and tasted the sauce again, straight from the source. This time, his face went pale. Then another server came back, this one looking panicked. Table 12 is complaining. And the food blogger at table 9 just posted something on Instagram. He held up his phone. The picture was of a half-eaten plate of our signature dish. The caption was simple and devastating. Beautiful presentation, but the signature lamb at the hearth has an unpleasantly sharp chemical aftertaste. A disappointing misstep. That was the first crack in the dam. Suddenly, the kitchen pass was flooded with returned plates. The chaos was no longer controlled. It was a full-blown crisis. Julian stormed into the kitchen, his charming facade gone replaced by a mask of pure fury. "What is going on?" he screamed, his voice cutting through the din. "What did you do to the sauce?" He grabbed a spoon and tasted it himself. He immediately recoiled, spitting into a nearby sink. "It's disgusting, it's ruined. Marco, what did you do?" The investors, noticing the commotion and the wave of returned food, were now standing at the entrance to the kitchen, their faces a mixture of confusion and anger. The dining room was falling apart. The kitchen was in chaos. My brother was imploding. And I stood in my corner, calmly scrubbing a scorched pan, my face a perfect mask of blank indifference. The demolition had begun. Julian's face, usually a confident mask of charm, was twisted into an ugly snarl. He jabbed a finger at Chef Marco, his voice shrill with panic. This is your fault. You're the chef. You're responsible for this poison. You're fired. Get out." Marco, a proud man with 2 decades of experience, simply stared back, his face a mixture of shock and disgust. He untied his apron, threw it onto the counter, and walked out without a word. The kitchen staff watched frozen. The investors, led by Mr. Harrison, pushed their way through the swinging doors, their faces grim. "Julian, what in God's name is going on?" Mr. Harrison demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "My clients are leaving. A food critic just called your signature dish an insult. Explain yourself." "It's the staff," Julian stammered, gesturing wildly. "Incompetence, sabotage. I'll fix it, I promise." The chaos was at its peak. Shouting the clatter of abandoned plates, the frantic energy of a sinking ship, and then a calm voice cut through the noise. "He's right. It's not the chef's fault." Every head turned. I was standing by the dish pit, having just taken off my soiled gray apron. Underneath, I was wearing a simple, clean black shirt. I was no longer hiding. I stepped forward out of the shadows. Julian looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, then narrowed with contempt. "Eliza, what are you doing? Get back to your station. The adults are talking." But Mr. Harrison held up a hand, silencing him. He looked at me, his eyes searching. He was a businessman, and he could smell the truth better than he could smell the ruined sauce. "Go on," he said. I took a breath, the air thick with tension. I wasn't a sister anymore. I wasn't a dishwasher. I was a scientist about to present her findings. "The problem isn't the cooking," I said, my voice clear and steady, projecting across the silent kitchen. "It's the primary aromatic ingredient in the sauce, the thyme." The restaurant switched from Provençal thyme to Moroccan thyme 2 days ago. Julian started to interrupt, but I kept my eyes fixed on Mr. Harrison. Moroccan thyme contains a higher concentration of a specific phenolic compound. I continued, the words I had practiced in my apartment flowing easily. When that compound is held at a sustained temperature of over 190 degrees Fahrenheit, for more than 2 hours, it undergoes thermal decomposition. It breaks down. And it creates the distinct, bitter chemical taste that you're all experiencing tonight. A stunned silence fell over the kitchen. The remaining cooks were staring at me with a newfound respect. Julian's face had gone from red to a pasty white. That's ridiculous," he sputtered. "She's a dishwasher. She's making things up to get back at me. She's trying to sabotage me." I met his panicked gaze, my expression unreadable. "You're right. I am a dishwasher," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "But I am a dishwasher who pays attention. And I am a dishwasher who knows that this decision wasn't a kitchen error." I reached into the pocket of my black pants and pulled out a single neatly folded piece of paper. I walked past my brother, his face, a mask of dawning horror, and handed the paper to Mr. Harrison. He unfolded it. It was the printed email chain. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as he read it. His eyes scanned the page, his expression hardening with every word. He looked from the paper to Julian, and then back to the paper. He then read the final lines aloud, his voice like chipping ice. It says here, a proposal from you, Eliza, suggesting a new supplier. And you recommend, and I quote, having Chef Marco run a large-scale batch test to ensure it meets your high standards. He paused, letting the words hang in the air before he delivered the final blow. He held up the paper for the other investors to see his finger pointing at the bottom of the page. And here is your reply. Julian sent to Miss Vance and the entire accounting department. Excellent. Implement immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than any shout, more damning than any accusation. It was the sound of a king being dethroned, the sound of a trap snapping shut. I turned to look at my brother. His mouth was open, but no words came out. He was ruined, and he knew it. I looked him right in the eye. This wasn't a kitchen error. I said, my voice clear and final. It was a business decision, your business decision. In the deafening silence of the kitchen, Julian finally crumbled. A choked, pathetic sob escaped his lips. He looked from the investors' stone-cold faces to mine, his eyes, pleading for a lifeline I would not throw. No one moved. No one spoke. His ruin was a tangible thing, a heavy cloak that settled over his shoulders. Mr. Harrison folded the printed email and tucked it neatly into his jacket pocket as if it were a legal document, which I suppose it now was. He didn't give Julian another glance. Instead, he turned to me. Miss Vance, he said, his voice all business. You have a problem. We have a much bigger one. My partners and I have over $1 million tied up in a restaurant that is, as of this moment, worthless. A restaurant I now understand that was your concept from the very beginning. I simply nodded, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The frantic adrenaline was gone, replaced by a strange and profound calm. I am prepared to offer you a deal, he continued. We will handle the legal and financial fallout with your brother. In return, you will take over this restaurant. You will rebrand it. You will run it exactly the way you described in your original business plan. We will give you full operational control and a majority stake. Save our investment, Miss Vance, and claim what is rightfully yours. And that was how it happened. Not with a shout, but with a business proposal. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Julian was ousted, his name scraped off the corporate documents. As I had predicted, the investors' legal team descended upon him with the full force of the law. They sued him for fraud, for breach of contract, for gross mismanagement. My email was Exhibit A. Faced with irrefutable proof of his deception, he was forced into personal bankruptcy. He lost everything. My parents called me, of course. First they pleaded, then they demanded that I forgive and forget and help my brother. My mother cried, accusing me of being cruel, of destroying the family. I listened quietly to her words, and for the first time, they had no power over me. I didn't destroy him. I said my voice even. His own choices did. I hung up the phone and blocked their numbers. Some legacies are not worth saving. My first act as the new owner was to call Chef Marco. I didn't offer him his old job back. I offered him a partnership. I told him I needed his experience, his wisdom. I needed someone I could trust. He accepted without hesitation. Together, we rebuilt. We gutted the kitchen of every cheap corner-cutting change Julian had made. We sourced the finest ingredients. We brought back the Spanish saffron. And on the front of the building, we took down the gaudy sign for the hearth. A few months later, we held our own grand opening. It was a much quieter affair. No red carpet, no celebrities, just good food, a warm room, and the quiet buzz of happy customers. The new sign above the door glowed softly in the evening light. It read Eliza's hearth. Tonight I stood at the pass watching the controlled, beautiful dance of my kitchen. The air smelled of roasting garlic and fresh bread. Chef Marco was at the stove, a small smile on his face as he inspected a plate of the 7-hour braised lamb before it went out. Our sauce was perfect. I looked across the dining room to a small framed photograph on the wall. It was the picture of my grandmother, her hands covered in flour, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled. I felt a sense of peace so deep it felt like coming home. He tried to steal my grandmother's legacy. He thought it was a collection of recipes, a brand to be exploited. But he was wrong. The legacy wasn't just the food. It was the integrity, the the passion, the strength to build something true and lasting. He tried to steal my grandmother's legacy. Instead, he forced me to build my own.